When Jonathan Roumie extended his hand to Pope Leo XIV before a global audience, the Pope looked directly at him and spoke two words that stunned everyone watching: "Not yet." The actor known for portraying Jesus froze as quiet gasps spread through St. Peter's Basilica, his hand still suspended in the air. But what the Pope quietly told him next changed everything Jonathan believed about his own life. Cameras recorded every moment as Jonathan realized this encounter was not about tradition. It was connected to a truth that had been hidden for 43 years. Locked inside the Vatican archives was a photograph that explained the entire mystery. A young Lebanese priest standing beside an even younger seminarian, neither aware that their lives would eventually converge in a way no one could have predicted. What Jonathan learned in that moment would either shake his faith completely or reveal that some family histories carry a meaning deeper than blood. And it all began with a few unexpected words. But to understand how a simple handshake could unravel a decades-old secret, we have to return to the moment this path began. Jonathan had been sitting in his modest Chicago apartment, staring at an official Vatican invitation that arrived without any prior indication. The thick cream envelope with its gold seal requested his presence for a special audience with Pope Leo XIV during the Feast of Divine Mercy. The invitation referenced his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen and described a conversation on faith within modern media. To Jonathan, it appeared to be another meaningful professional engagement. What he didn't know was that Pope Leo XIV had been preparing for this meeting in ways that would have puzzled his closest advisors. For weeks, the Pope had spent long hours in private prayer while holding a faded photograph of a Lebanese priest who had passed away in 1981. That priest, Father Roumie, was Jonathan's grandfather, a man the future Pope had known during one of the most difficult periods of his own life. This connection wasn't recorded in any Vatican file, and Pope Leo had planned to keep it private until the exact moment he felt was right. Jonathan's grandmother had often shared stories of Lebanon, stories about faith surviving conflict and hardship. She passed away when he was 12, but the wooden rosary she gave him still hung beside his bed. She used to tell him that God would one day use him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Holding the Vatican letter, he wondered whether she had sensed something greater than his acting career. The Vatican instructions were clear. Jonathan would greet the Pope briefly before engaging in a discussion about faith and popular culture. He had met well-known figures and religious leaders because of The Chosen. But as his flight neared Rome, he quietly prayed that he would represent Christ with sincerity in whatever awaited him, unaware that his life had been building toward this moment for years. During the flight, Jonathan reflected on how drastically his life had changed since being cast as Jesus. He had gone from a struggling actor to the central figure of one of the most influential Christian series ever produced. Yet success hadn't altered his personal habits. His daily prayers, his practice of giving away most of his income, and his routine of calling fans who were hospitalized. The role had strengthened his faith rather than making it something superficial. St. Peter's Basilica was even more extraordinary than he imagined. Jonathan arrived early so he could pray before the formal audience. Kneeling in a small chapel, he felt the weight of being in the center of Catholic history. As other invitees arrived, a Christian musician, a filmmaker, and a best-selling religious author, they exchanged brief conversations, all aware that something significant awaited them. The Swiss guards led the group through hallways filled with centuries of tradition. Jonathan reached for his grandmother's rosary in his pocket, a gesture he always made before important events. While others discussed their excitement, Jonathan felt something deeper, as though this ancient place recognized him in a way he couldn't explain. When they entered the papal audience chamber, Pope Leo XIV was already seated on a simple wooden chair. He appeared smaller than Jonathan expected, yet his presence filled the elaborately decorated room. His eyes were closed in prayer, and in his hands was a rosary that looked strikingly similar to Jonathan's. The group stood in respectful silence, waiting for the Pope to open his eyes and begin the formal audience. Pope Leo XIV opened his eyes and observed the group with the calm focus of someone who had spent decades understanding people. His attention moved from one guest to another, acknowledging each with a subtle nod. But when his eyes settled on Jonathan, his expression shifted. The warmth disappeared, replaced by something far more layered: surprise, familiarity, and perhaps sadness. He looked at Jonathan for several long seconds before turning away. The formal introductions proceeded as scheduled. Each attendee was presented to the Pope along with a brief summary of their work in Christian media. The Christian musician approached first, receiving a kind handshake and blessing. The filmmaker followed, and the Pope commented briefly on the influence of visual storytelling. Jonathan waited for his turn, preparing to express how grateful he was to be there and how seriously he approached portraying Christ. "Your Holiness," the Vatican aide announced, "may I present Jonathan Roumie, the actor who portrays Jesus in The Chosen." Jonathan stepped forward with respectful confidence. He extended his hand, expecting the usual greeting and possibly a short blessing. Instead, Pope Leo XIV looked at Jonathan's hand, then directly into his eyes. What he said was barely above a whisper, but the quiet room made it unmistakable. "Not yet." Jonathan's hand remained raised as confusion crossed his face. The other guests shifted in their places, unsure whether they had just witnessed a simple procedural issue or something meaningful. The Pope continued to study Jonathan, and in his eyes Jonathan saw not refusal, but a kind of recognition he couldn't explain. "Your Holiness," Jonathan said quietly, his hand still extended. The room was so silent that the distant sounds of traffic outside the Vatican seemed unusually loud. Pope Leo XIV slowly rose from his chair, his movements careful and deliberate. He stepped closer to Jonathan, leaning in so only Jonathan could hear him. "I knew your grandfather," the Pope said softly, "and I made him a promise that I still intend to keep." Jonathan lowered his hand as shock replaced confusion. His grandfather had died when Jonathan was an infant, and he knew very little about him apart from the fact that he had served as a priest in Lebanon during the Civil War. His grandmother rarely discussed those years, only saying they were too painful to remember. Now the Pope was saying not only that he had known his grandfather, but that a promise had been made involving Jonathan. The other guests watched silently as Pope Leo XIV gestured for Jonathan to walk with him. They stepped aside to a small alcove beneath a painting of the Holy Family. From within his robes, the Pope removed the worn photograph he had prayed with earlier and handed it to Jonathan. The black and white photo showed a young priest beside a young seminarian. "The priest on the left is your grandfather, Father Michael Roumie," the Pope explained quietly. "The man on the right is me 43 years ago in Beirut." Jonathan looked closely at the photo, recognizing his own features in his grandfather's face. The same eyes and the same calm, determined expression. "We served together during some of the worst bombing," the Pope continued. "He saved my life more than once and I saved his until the day I could not." Jonathan swallowed hard. His grandmother had never told him his grandfather had died while protecting others, only that he died serving God. "Father Michael was killed shielding a family from sniper fire," Pope Leo XIV said. "He pushed them into a basement and stayed above to divert attention. As he was dying he asked me for one promise. He said that if God ever gave his family someone who would proclaim Christ to the world, I should help them understand their purpose." The weight of the story settled heavily on Jonathan. His acting career, his unexpected casting in The Chosen, his strong connection to portraying Jesus, all of it suddenly felt like pieces of a larger purpose he had never fully seen. "He never met you," the Pope said, "but he prayed for his future grandchildren every night. He believed God would use one of them in a meaningful way. When I learned about your work, when I saw your face, I recognized you immediately." Jonathan looked up from the photo. "Then why didn't you shake my hand?" he asked quietly. For the first time during the audience, Pope Leo XIV smiled. "Because your grandfather asked me to promise that if I ever met the grandson who would portray Jesus, I must not treat him like an actor or a public figure. I was to treat him as someone God might be preparing for something far deeper than entertainment." The Pope carefully returned the photograph to his robes. Then he did something that made Jonathan's knees weaken. Pope Leo XIV knelt before Jonathan, lowering his head like someone asking for a blessing instead of giving one. "Your grandfather died protecting others," he said, "and you now protect souls. The handshake I once denied you as an actor, I now ask for from you as the representative of Christ on earth." Jonathan stood frozen, staring at the Pope of the Catholic Church kneeling in front of him. The room fell silent. Several guests quietly lifted their phones, realizing they were witnessing something rare and unexpected. But Jonathan wasn't thinking about the cameras or the significance of the moment. His mind went to his grandmother's stories, her belief that God had a purpose for their family, and the growing awareness that his entire life had been leading to this moment. If you're still watching this unbelievable moment and believe God has a purpose for your life too, hit the like button and comment, "I believe." Let's see how many people trust that his plans are always perfect. With shaking hands, Jonathan reached down and helped Pope Leo XIV rise to his feet. Instead of offering a handshake, Jonathan hugged him the way he would have hugged his grandfather if he were alive. The older man embraced him in return, and they stood together in a quiet moment of recognition, grief, and gratitude. When they stepped apart, Both men had tears in their eyes. Your grandfather would be proud, Pope Leo XIV whispered. More than that, he would tell you this is only the beginning. The Pope pulled out a simple wooden cross on a leather cord. This was his. He wore it the day he died. I've kept it for 43 years, waiting to give it to you. Jonathan accepted it with deep respect, feeling the weight of the cross and the smoothness from years of prayerful hands holding it. The other guests stayed back, still stunned by what they were witnessing. They had expected a routine meeting about faith in media but instead observed what felt like a personal spiritual reunion between the Pope and an actor they barely knew. Jonathan placed the cord around his neck, and the cross settled naturally against his chest as if it belonged there. Pope Leo XIV finally addressed the room. "Forgive the unusual nature of our meeting," he said, his voice firm yet warm. "Sometimes God arranges moments that go beyond protocol. Today Mr. Roumie has received not only a blessing, but the completion of a promise made by a dying martyr who happened to be his grandfather." A Christian musician spoke first, clearly moved. "Your Holiness, are you saying Jonathan's role in the Chosen was divinely guided?" The Pope smiled at her honesty. "I am saying that 43 years ago, a dying priest in Lebanon prophesied that his grandson would show Christ to the world. And today millions know Jesus more closely because of this man's portrayal. You can decide whether that's coincidence or providence." Jonathan finally found his voice, though it was unsteady. "Your Holiness, I need to understand something. If my grandfather asked you to do this, why now? Why did you wait?" The Pope's expression grew thoughtful, and he motioned for everyone to sit in the semicircle of chairs. Everyone sensed that what he was about to say was important. "Your grandfather's exact words," Pope Leo XIV began, "were these: 'When you meet my grandson who will show Jesus to the world, do not greet him as the world does. Make him understand that he carries more than his own calling. He carries the prayers of martyrs, the hopes of the persecuted, and the faith of those who will never see their prayers answered. I had to wait until I knew you understood the weight of your work.'" Jonathan leaned forward, gripping the wooden cross. "But how could he have known? I wasn't even born. My father wasn't even married." The Pope's eyes brightened with joy, the kind that comes from witnessing perfect timing. "Your grandfather spent his final months in constant prayer, especially for the future of your family. The night before he died, he told me he had a vision of a young man who looked just like him, standing before cameras and crowds, speaking the words of Jesus with such sincerity that hearts would be changed. A filmmaker in the group couldn't contain his amazement. This is incredible, like watching a prophecy unfold in real life." Pope Leo XIV nodded. The Lebanese Christians understood prophecy in ways the West often forgets. They lived with persecution and the threat of death for their faith. In such conditions, God often gave them glimpses of hope, promises that their suffering had purpose, and that their families would be blessed beyond their lifetime. Jonathan felt almost dizzy as he absorbed the meaning. Every struggle in his career, every doubt about portraying Jesus, every prayer asking God to use him, all of it had been part of a promise made by a grandfather he never met. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," he whispered. "Knowing people died praying for my future, knowing my grandfather believed God would use our family this way, it's overwhelming." Pope Leo XIV leaned forward with the calmness of someone who had guided many through heavy burdens. "Your grandfather knew you would feel this way. He told me to tell you that strength isn't the goal, faithfulness is. You don't have to be strong enough for this calling. You only need to be faithful enough to let God's strength work through you." The words struck Jonathan gently but deeply, reminding him of every moment during filming when he felt unequipped, until he surrendered to something greater than himself. The best-selling author, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "Mr. Roumie, do you feel the weight of this responsibility, knowing your portrayal may be the closest many people ever come to seeing Jesus?" Jonathan stayed silent for several moments, his hand resting on the cross. "I've always felt that weight," he said at last. "But I assumed it came from my own sense of responsibility to the role. Now I see it was something deeper, something passed down to me." Pope Leo XIV stood and walked toward a tall window facing St. Peter's Square. "Your grandfather made me promise one more thing," he said, still looking outside. "He asked me to present you with a specific question when the time came." The Pope turned back to Jonathan, his expression firm. He wanted to know if he would continue his mission, not only as an actor playing Jesus, but as his representative to the Lebanese Christian community that still suffers today. The room grew still as everyone understood the significance of what had been asked. Jonathan had received messages from persecuted Christians around the world, but he had never considered himself someone with authority to help them. What would that involve exactly? He asked calmly. The Pope sat down again, his movements measured. It would mean accepting that your platform as the actor known for portraying Jesus gives you a rare opportunity to speak on behalf of people who cannot speak for themselves. The Lebanese Christians continue to face persecution. Pope Leo XIV continued. They are still dying for their faith. They need someone the world will pay attention to, someone who can highlight their suffering. Your grandfather believed that God would raise someone from your family line to be that voice. Seeing you now and seeing how your portrayal of Christ has impacted millions, I believe he was right. Jonathan felt the weight of this reality settle over him like a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. The Christian musician voiced the question on everyone's mind. But why Jonathan specifically? There are other Christian actors with influence. Pope Leo XIV gave a sad smile. Because Jonathan carries the blood of martyrs. Because his grandfather died protecting others. Because when he speaks about Jesus, it is more than acting, it is a continuation of a family legacy of faith that cost his grandfather everything. The persecuted will hear him in a way they may not hear others. Jonathan closed his eyes, remembering his grandmother's stories about their homeland and her belief that their family had a unique purpose. What would my grandfather want me to do exactly? He asked. Pope Leo XIV opened a drawer and took out a thick folder. There are 12 Lebanese Christian communities around the world that are experiencing severe persecution, he said. Your grandfather wanted you to visit them, pray with them, and help the world understand that the suffering of early Christians continues even today. But I'm just an actor, Jonathan said. I'm not a priest or a missionary or a diplomat. The Pope's smile was gentle but steady. Your grandfather was just a priest when he saved my life and the lives of many others. Mother Teresa was just a nun when she forever changed how the world understands poverty. Sometimes the people God chooses are important not because of their title, but because of their faithfulness. The comparison to Mother Teresa overwhelmed Jonathan. He couldn't imagine being mentioned alongside someone like her. The filmmaker leaned forward with enthusiasm. We could document this journey, Christ's representative visiting persecuted Christians worldwide. It could bring huge awareness. But Pope Leo XIV shook his head. This is not about making content or drawing attention to Jonathan. This is about honoring the prayers of a dying martyr and serving communities that must know they are not forgotten by God or by fellow believers. Jonathan opened his eyes and looked directly at the Pope. If I agree to this, I need full clarity. Are you asking me to speak for the Catholic Church, to represent you officially? The Pope's response surprised everyone. I'm asking you to represent your grandfather. The Church will support you, but this calling comes from a higher authority than my office. It comes from the prayers of a man who gave his life believing God would use his family to help others. A heavy silence filled the ornate room. Jonathan could feel everyone watching him, but more than that, he sensed something deeper, a connection to a grandfather he had never known. Before I give you my answer, he said quietly, I need to understand something. How did my grandfather die? I want the full story. Pope Leo XIV nodded, knowing Jonathan needed the truth before agreeing to something so life-changing. It was December 15, 1981, the Pope began, his voice respectful, as if retelling something sacred. The bombing had continued for 3 days. Your grandfather and I were sheltering in the basement of St. George Cathedral with about 30 families. The children were crying, the adults praying, and supplies were running out. That's when we heard a sniper take position on the building across the street. Jonathan tightened his grip on the wooden cross as the Pope continued. The families needed to escape to a safer place, but the sniper had a full view of the only exit. Your grandfather looked at me and said, "The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." Before Jonathan could react, his grandfather had already grabbed the church bell rope and began ringing it loudly. Drawing the sniper's focus, he stepped into the open, making himself the target so the families could escape through the back. Jonathan listened as the Pope described watching from the window, his grandfather standing in the courtyard, ringing the bell and praying the Our Father as loudly as he could. The sniper shot him 3 times, yet he did not stop praying. By the time he fell, all 30 families were safely out. Pope Leo XIV's voice wavered. I held him as he died. His final words were about you, the grandson he would never meet, but who would continue his mission in ways he never could. Jonathan's tears were flowing openly now, and he wasn't the only one emotional. His grandfather's sacrifice reframed everything Jonathan thought he knew about his own purpose. He prayed for me while he was dying? Jonathan whispered. The Pope nodded. He asked God to let his grandson know that love is stronger than fear, faith is stronger than death, and the suffering of God's people is never forgotten. He prayed that you would take this truth to the world. Jonathan stood slowly, feeling as though every stage of his life had led him to this decision, acting in the chosen, unexpected invitations to speak on faith, and now standing here in the Vatican. It all felt connected to his grandfather's final prayer. "Your Holiness," Jonathan said, his voice steadier than before, "I accept whatever calling my grandfather's prayers have placed on my life." Pope Leo XIV's expression brightened. "Then you will go to the 12 communities." Jonathan nodded with determination. "I'll go wherever my grandfather's legacy requires. But I have one condition." The Pope lifted an eyebrow, interested in what condition Jonathan might have. "I want to visit his grave first. I want to pray where he gave his life. I need to fully understand what I'm receiving before I try to carry it." "That can be arranged," the Pope replied immediately. "In fact, it should be. You need to walk where he walked and grasp the cost of the faith you will represent." The people in the room sat in stunned silence, realizing they were witnessing something far more meaningful than a celebrity meeting a religious leader. They were watching a family legacy complete itself after 43 years. The author finally spoke again. "This is extraordinary. A prophecy fulfilled, a legacy restored, a calling revealed. Jonathan, do you understand what has just taken place?" Jonathan looked around at the faces of those who had expected an ordinary meeting and instead witnessed what felt like a divine appointment long in the making. "I think I'm beginning to understand," he said. "But honestly, it's much larger than anything I imagined about my life or career. Playing Jesus on a TV show now feels like preparation for something far more significant." The Pope nodded. "That is exactly what your grandfather believed. He saw your acting not as the end, but as preparation for representing Christ to those who urgently need hope." Pope Leo XIV returned to his desk and began writing on official stationery. "I'm giving you a letter of introduction for each of the 12 communities," he explained. "It will describe who you are, who your grandfather was, and why they should hear your message." He paused and looked up. "But Jonathan, the letter only opens the doors. What happens after that depends entirely on how faithfully you carry your grandfather's spirit." As the Pope wrote, Jonathan felt an unexpected sense of completeness, as though missing pieces of his identity were finally falling into place. The childhood dreams of being someone important, the sense of calling he couldn't explain, and the deep connection he felt while portraying Jesus. Suddenly everything made sense. He wasn't simply an actor who portrayed Christ. He was the fulfillment of a dying man's prayer. The Christian musician broke the quiet. "Jonathan, how do you feel knowing that millions will learn your portrayal of Jesus is tied to this incredible family history?" Jonathan considered his response. "It makes the responsibility heavier but clearer. I never felt worthy to play Jesus, but I thought that was just normal insecurity. Now I understand it was deeper. I was carrying a calling much greater than myself." Pope Leo XIV finished writing and handed Jonathan the sealed letter. "This includes the locations and contacts for all 12 communities, along with my testimony about your grandfather and my blessing for your mission." He then handed Jonathan a smaller envelope. "This is something else your grandfather asked me to give you when the time was right. I have waited 43 years to fulfill this request." Jonathan opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten note in Arabic with an English translation. Read, "To my grandson who will show Jesus to the world. Remember that you are not simply acting like Jesus, you are carrying Jesus to those who need to see him. When the world feels too heavy, remember the cross was heavy too, but love made it light. Your grandfather, Father Malik Roumie." The room went silent as Jonathan read the words. The note was dated December 14, 1981, the day before his grandfather was killed. "He wrote this the night before he died," Jonathan whispered. The Pope nodded. "He spent that night writing letters to family he would never meet. Your letter was the last he wrote before sleeping." Jonathan folded the letter carefully and placed it in his wallet beside his grandmother's prayer card. "Your Holiness, I need to ask something that may sound strange. Do you really believe my grandfather could see the future? Could he truly know I would play Jesus, meet you, and be called to this mission?" The Pope answered immediately. "I believe that when someone is willing to die for others, God sometimes gives them glimpses of the eternal perspective. Your grandfather saw beyond his death to the purpose it would serve." The filmmaker asked what everyone wondered. What happens now? When does he leave for Lebanon? When does the mission begin? Jonathan looked to the Pope for direction. Pope Leo XIV smiled, relieved to have completed a long-held duty. That depends on how quickly Jonathan can arrange his affairs. But he should begin with prayer and preparation. This calling requires not only faith but wisdom, to serve persecuted communities without placing them at greater risk. Jonathan nodded. I'll need to talk to my management, my family, and the producers of The Chosen. This will change everything about my life and career. The Pope's tone grew serious. It should change everything. Your grandfather didn't sacrifice his life for you to simply have a successful acting career. He died so you could carry Christ to those who desperately need to experience Him, using whatever platform God gives you. As the meeting drew to a close, Jonathan felt a mix of anticipation and fear about the road ahead. He arrived at the Vatican simply as an actor grateful for an unexpected honor. He was leaving as the heir to his martyred grandfather's prophetic mission, carrying the prayers of a man who had died believing God would one day use his family to support persecuted Christians around the world. The wooden cross around his neck felt heavier now, but it was a weight he finally understood. It was something he had been meant to carry. Pope Leo XIV stood and motioned for Jonathan to join him in the center of the room. Before we conclude, he said, there is one last request your grandfather asked of me. The Pope reached for a small silver box that had remained on his desk through the entire audience. Inside was something that made Jonathan inhale sharply, a simple gold ring engraved with the seal of St. George, the patron saint of Lebanon. This was your grandfather's ordination ring, the Pope continued. He removed it while he was dying and asked me to place it on his grandson's hand when his calling became clear. Jonathan's knees almost gave way as he stared at the ring. He gave you his ordination ring, for me? The Pope nodded with calm seriousness. He said that although you may never become an ordained priest, you would serve as Christ's representative in ways that required equal dedication and sacrifice. He wanted you to wear this as a reminder that you carry not only your own calling, but the shared priesthood of believers who have given their lives for their faith. With steady but emotional hands, Pope Leo XIV slid the ring onto Jonathan's right hand. It fit perfectly as if it had been sized for him decades earlier. With this ring, the Pope said formally, you accept the calling to become Christ's voice for the unheard, Christ's hands for the vulnerable, and Christ's presence for those who believe God has forgotten them. As the ring settled into place, Jonathan felt something shift inside, a sense of purpose and identity far deeper than anything he had ever experienced. The guests watched quietly as what had begun as a formal audience transformed into something resembling a commissioning. Jonathan glanced around the room and sensed that these witnesses had been intentionally present for this moment. Your Holiness, he said, voice thick with emotion, I accept this calling. But I ask for your prayers. I need the Church's blessing for the work my grandfather entrusted to me. The Pope placed both hands on Jonathan's shoulders with pastoral authority. Jonathan Roumie, grandson of the martyr Father Mikhail Roumie, I commission you to carry Christ's light to the persecuted, the forgotten, and the suffering. Go in the name of Jesus, with the blessing of the Church and with the prayers of your grandfather, who goes before you in the great cloud of witnesses. The prayer that followed felt less like a blessing and more like stepping fully into his true identity. Jonathan sensed a presence filling the room with warmth and clarity. For a second, he thought he saw the image of a young priest beside him, a hand resting on his other shoulder. When he blinked, the figure disappeared, but the sense of companionship remained. His grandfather's prayers had carried him to this moment, and now their impact was being released into his mission. When the prayer ended, Pope Leo XIV did something that stunned the room once more. He knelt again, this time taking Jonathan's hand with the new ring and kissing it respectfully. I am old, he said quietly. My ability to serve persecuted Christians directly is limited. But you are young and you have a platform that reaches millions. What I can no longer do, you must do, on my behalf and in your grandfather's name. The image of the Pope kneeling before an actor would have been controversial if not for the profound spiritual context. Jonathan helped him to his feet and then, moved by emotion, embraced him like a son embracing a father. Thank you for honoring your promise to my grandfather, he whispered. Thank you for waiting 43 years to pass on what he entrusted to you. The Pope's reply was soft. Thank you for being worthy of his sacrifice. And for becoming the man he believed you would one day become. A Christian musician who had been recording only parts of the meeting lowered her phone, tears streaming down her face. I feel like I just witnessed something sacred, she said. This wasn't a meeting, this was a prophecy coming to life. The other guests nodded, aware that they had witnessed something that would influence not only Jonathan's life, but also the lives of persecuted Christians across the world. The Pope returned to his desk and retrieved one final object, a leather-bound journal. "This belonged to your grandfather," he said. "He wrote in it every day during his final months. I've kept it safe, waiting to return it at the right time." Jonathan accepted the journal with quiet reverence, aware that it held his grandfather's prayers, reflections, and insights for a future he knew he wouldn't see. On the first page was an inscription that made Jonathan pause. "For my grandson who will carry Christ to the world. These are the prayers I write for you before I meet you. May they guide you when the path becomes difficult, and remind you that love is always stronger than death. Father Mikhail Roumie." The handwriting was careful, the message clear, written by a man addressing someone he would meet only in eternity. The formal audience closed with the group kneeling as Pope Leo XIV prayed over Jonathan's mission and over the 12 persecuted communities he would soon visit. Yet the formality now felt unnecessary. The true work had already been accomplished, the restoration of a family legacy and the fulfillment of a martyr's final prayer. As they rose, Jonathan noticed his grandfather's ring catching the sunlight through the ancient windows, scattering small rainbows across the marble floor. It felt like a symbol of hope for what lay ahead. One by one, the guests hugged him, recognizing that this encounter would change not only his path, but also the lives of those suffering for their faith. The Pope personally walked Jonathan to the door, an honor usually given only to heads of state. At the threshold, he handed Jonathan a small silver key. "This opens your grandfather's personal chapel at the ruins of St. George Cathedral in Beirut," he explained. "When you visit Lebanon, spend time there in prayer before beginning your mission. Let him teach you what I cannot." Jonathan accepted the key with deep respect. The weight of 43 years of expectation was finally being released from the Pope's shoulders, and Jonathan could see peace settling over him. As Jonathan prepared to leave, he turned back one last time to see Pope Leo XIV standing in the doorway, hands folded in prayer. The image stayed with him, the successor of St. Peter completing a sacred promise made to a martyred priest. Jonathan touched the wooden cross, felt the weight of the ring, and held the journal close. He was no longer simply an actor who portrayed Jesus. He was the living answer to a dying man's prayer, sent to bring Christ's love to the forgotten. 6 months later, Jonathan stood in the restored sanctuary of St. George Cathedral in Beirut, reading from his grandfather's journal to Lebanese Christians who had endured decades of hardship. His grandfather's cross hung around his neck and the ordination ring gleamed in the candlelight as he spoke. They didn't see him as a celebrity or as the actor who played Jesus. They saw him as Father Mikhail's grandson, returned to continue what his grandfather had begun. Their tears were not for meeting a public figure, but because they were witnessing the fulfillment of prayers their own families had whispered during years of suffering. The 12 communities the Pope mentioned became only the start of Jonathan's expanded work. Word spread across persecuted Christian networks that Father Mikhail's grandson had stepped forward as an advocate for those who had no voice. Jonathan's portrayal of Jesus deepened as he carried the lived pain and resilient faith of persecuted believers into his work, helping viewers around the world feel Christ's love for those who suffer. Reflecting on the Vatican moment when the Pope refused to shake his hand, Jonathan realized that some rejections are actually redirections, meant to guide us into greater callings. His grandfather's final prayers had created a bridge through time, linking a martyr's sacrifice to the purpose of his grandson's life 43 years later. If this story touched something in you, if you believe God still uses ordinary people for extraordinary purposes, hit that subscribe button because we have more true stories of faith that will inspire and challenge you. Share a comment below about a time when God's timing surprised you. Because sometimes the greatest miracles unfold slowly, and the most meaningful callings come from people we never had the chance to meet in this life.